What is a fallacy? Can you tell me what a fallacy is?
All right, welcome everybody. I'm going to just give a brief statement about what I think the basics are of the parameters of, first of all, who is a heretic, what is a heretic, and then we'll get into open forum and people can discuss Francis and his disaster papacy. First thing I would say is that in the patristic teaching, when you look through the church fathers in general, when you look through things like the rudder, the collection of canonical statements, canonical laws, canonical penances, and so forth, penalties, you'll find a pretty consistent teaching that it's our duty as Christians to absolutely remove ourselves from all heretics. In fact, we're supposed to have nothing but uh, abject rejection of a heretic. We're not supposed to have toleration, love, pretending that love in the sense of like fake tolerance and niceness. A heretic is one of the most grievous of sins. Period. A heretic is an enemy of Christ and the church. They are a person who are obstinate and pertinacious and willful in their rejection of the truth. So a heretic is not somebody who's just merely wrong, right? It's just somebody who has been shown, demonstrated many times that there is a correct position to their false position, and they persevere and they're obstinate in that position. So, for example, somebody like James White, an obvious heretic. James White has been rebuked, disproven, refuted for many, many, many years. And James White continues to be a teacher of heretic, heretical doctrines. So, likewise, the papacy is, from the Orthodox perspective, is heterodox. It is a heretical institution. Just because you have some things right does not make you not a heretic. Just because you have good intentions does not make you a an Orthodox person. So again, there's a distinction between a material heretic and a formal heretic. Sometimes you hear this terminology. This just refers to the difference between someone merely being wrong, like your Baptist grandmother or something like that, versus somebody who obstinately teaches and pushes their errors in the face of correction, in the face of, uh, all due process, all due, church teaching, etc. People who are excommunicated, sometimes they will continue in that error. And this is why, for example, in the Orthodox Church, many of you may not know this, but we have Triumph of Orthodoxy Sunday. And most bishoprics that do the full liturgy, they actually pronounce the anathemas on a whole host of groups that never went away. And there's some flexibility in that because some bishops will actually add modern groups like, say, Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons to that list of uh, heterodox groups. In fact, Metropolitan Seraphim of Praeus even includes Zionists in that group. So there is no such thing as this idea that we're all the same church and there's not a single visible church, and that there's no such thing as a heretic. Again, if you control F search the rudder, as I did the other day, for heretic, you will find about 100, and I think it was like 100 plus references to how the church in church law has viewed heresy and heretics. In fact, the statement from St. Cyril's Catechetical Lecture 6 that we must hate all heretics is even included in the rudder. Now, does that mean that your job is to have a personal, vengeful hatred for a person and try to, go after them and destroy their life or something like that? No, I don't think that's what it means to, in one sense, have a hatred of the heretic and the heresy, and at the same time, love them. Both of those things are true at the same time, just like the church can pray imprecatory prayers, and she does. For example, in Russian prayer books, you'll find prayers against the godless Hagarenes. We pray for the Orthodox emperors and kings to have victory over the godless Hagarenes and the Mohammedans. So, in one sense, we do not want them to succeed and be victorious. And in another sense, yes, we do still want their conversion and their salvation. In fact, anathemas and the warnings of heresy are all intended to be remedial. They're medicinal in nature. So the purpose of despising heresies and heretics in one sense, at the same time as you love the person and seeking their healing, is not a contradiction, and it's not impossible. It's two different senses and approaches to what we like and don't like about the person. In a sense, you could say, well, we're supposed to, love the sinner and hate the sin. That's true. However, sometimes sinners are so pertinacious and wicked that they actually kind of unite themselves with their sin or their actions, such that they become what's called what's called in history of the church heresiarchs. A heresiarch is not just merely a heretic, but a widely known, a widely pushed, and a largely followed heretic. So, for example, Nestorius, Arius, Dioscorus, Severus, these are heresiarchs for the Orthodox Church. Paul of Samosata, Sabellius, right, et cetera, Marcion, because they became the founders of entire movements. Likewise, the godless Mohammed. In fact, the Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages used to call it the godless sect of Mohammed. Uh, the language is very strong in the Middle Ages, even in the Roman Catholic Church for the Muslims. So with that in mind, it should be obvious that somebody asked me today, are you saying we're supposed to hate our grandmothers? No, I never said that. Rather, there's nuance and there's wisdom in terms of the application of these principles. So it's not an all or nothing thing. It's not a situation where you say, well, my Baptist grandmother who doesn't know anything about theology, that's the same level, that's the same equivalence to Pope Francis, who spent the last 15 years or whatever basically destroying Christianity in the West, promoting Skittles, civil unions, promoting blessing of Skittles couples, Pachamama, Amazon Synod. I mean, on and on and on and on. And so it's weird that people would then, when a person dies, and I understand that it's general practice for most people to think that when a person dies, you want to focus on the good things that they did. But in the case of a exceedingly wicked person, and this is something that modernity doesn't understand, for modernity and modern people, they actually think that being nice or being cordial or being tolerant is the highest of all virtues and is what love is. That is not what love is. Love requires and demands boundaries. And in fact, in the patristic teaching and consensus, heresy is one of the worst sins. In fact, heresy is 1,000 times worse than you being impatient with a person. A heretic is 1,000, 10,000 times worse than a person losing their temper or making a fat joke. And so people are so severely deluded and their mind is out of whack that even murder, a heresiarch is worse than a murderer. And the church fathers teach this. Why is that? Because a heresiarch murders the soul, and the soul is more important than the body. But today's people are so out of whack, so delusional, so ignorant that they actually think that being intolerant or not being nice is worse than being a global heresiarch deluding countless numbers of people. No, it's modernity that is wrong. It's the libs and the tolerance worshipers that are wrong. And it's easy to demonstrate this from the church fathers because you will never find them talking about heretics in any other way than what I've described. And that's why, in fact, when I posted this about what St. Cyril of Jerusalem says in the Catechetical Lectures, I had multiple Roman Catholics saying, well, he's just simply wrong. I mean, this is one of your own saints and doctors, dude. What do you mean he's wrong? And I said, all the saints speak this way of heretics. So it's not even like controversial. It's kind of an obvious point for anyone that spent any time or significant time in the church fathers. It doesn't matter which church father you pick. None of them will say anything different than what I've said. They will tell you the exact same thing, that heresy is worse than fornication. It's worse than murder. It's worse than the other offenses because it's a spiritual delusion and a spiritual murdering of the soul. And they say the same for schism. Schism is a sin against brotherly love. Now, how many people in modernity or even in the church, so-called, even in the so-called Orthodox circles, how many of them do you think conceive of heresy as a sin worse than murder? I will bet you most of them don't. But that tells you how far off people are in their priorities and understanding the patristic consensus and the mind of the church, or the phronema of the church. So I'll open it up from there. And I'm happy to go into any of the text. We can go into the patristic citations. We can go into uh, Proverbs. We can go into, there's multiple places in Proverbs where it talks about celebrating the death of the wicked. So this idea that you should never do that, the church celebrated when Arius passed away. And he died an ignominious, disastrous death. It's very famous. Now, why would we celebrate a wicked heresiarch passing away if it was never right to do that, or never good to celebrate? And the same thing came up, by the way, when David Rockefeller and Brzezinski died. I posted the exact same Proverbs verses about the people celebrate, the righteous celebrate when the wicked perish, or when a wicked king perishes, or wicked ruler perishes. How did Jesus speak about Herod? Did Jesus ever say nice, cordial things about Herod? No, he calls him a dog. He calls him a fox, an unclean demon, basically a goblin. Did Jesus speak well of Herod? How does the New Testament speak of Nero? Well, he was a kind ruler who had he believed in what he believed in. No, he's called a beast, an antichrist, a demon. So this idea that everyone is nice and cordial and that's what the essence of Christianity is, it's just not true at all.
Chill out, Jay. Chill out. Chill out.